Thanks to the organizers for putting this together and for including us on the program. This is joint work with Chris from NYU and Ahuka Michi from Royal Holloway. I'm at the Board of Governors, so I have a required disclaimer. I know people are paying attention to what the Fed has to say today, but this is not one of those official Fed statements. This is my views, and if I'm lucky, the views of my co-authors as well. Okay, so motivation. So we are kind of motivated by two facts. The first fact is that wage changes, both within and across job spells, seem to be important for understanding the sources of wage inequality over the life cycle. So we're going to use data from the NLSY in this paper. I'll tell you more about the data sample when we get to it. But these are changes in log wages year over year between NLSY interview dates. And we're looking at the difference in log wages. So if you look at people who stay in the same job from one interview to the next, you see that, I should just say that these are people very early in their life cycle. So these are not the kind of wage changes you would see over the whole life cycle. These are very young workers. So if you look at wage changes for people who stay in their same job, you see that people who are college graduates, their wages tend to increase a little bit more. College graduates have even a larger advantage when you look at what happens to workers who switch from one job to another between interview dates. So for an average job switcher, someone with only a high school education, their wage is going to go, log wage goes up by 11%. For someone with some colleges, 15%. Someone with a college degree or more goes up by 20%. So there's a lot of wage inequality over the life cycle that's coming from both changes within jobs and changes across jobs. And we'll have another look at these later. You can see the people with college, where they really benefit is where you look at job transitions, where in between the two jobs there's a period of non-employment. You see that's a period of very low, a transition associated with very low wage growth for people with less education, but significantly more for people with college. And of course, there are different probabilities also by education. So that's our first fact. The second fact that we're motivated here is that employed workers seem to build human capital by engaging on training on the job training. So if you look at, again, at this NLSY 97 cohort, 15% of people report having been enrolled in some formal training program at least once. And there are differences, again, by education. And this training is not what some models think of as education, of training as just when you come into a job, you have some initial training, and then you go off and produce. So less than half of these people report having gotten training at the beginning of the job. Many more seem to be continually getting training as time goes on. So there seems to be some persistent training behavior, and we think this is likely associated with human capital accumulation and wage growth. So that's kind of the set of facts that we want to get after. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to analyze the role of on-the-job training in human capital accumulation and look at productivity and wage growth in a non-competitive setting. By which I mean we're going to start with a pretty standard search and match search model with on-the-job search. Within this model, we're going to allow for heterogeneity both in worker ability and in the quality of matches between employers and employees. And then crucially, we're going to allow workers to improve on either of these measures, either their general ability or the quality of the match, by engaging in on-the-job training. And that on-the-job training is going to be costly in the sense that time spent training is going to take away from production. So that's what the model is going to look like. We're going to estimate the model using data on wages and employment transitions and training, which we're going to take from the NLSY. And then once we have an estimated model, we're going to run a policy experiment where we impose a $15 per hour minimum wage, which is people are discussing these days. And we're going to look at the effect of that policy, not just on things like unemployment and wages, but on training as well.
Could you just define this training? It's a little strange in the sense that if I go off and take a class at a community college, but I work at my job, so I go to night school, is that training in your sense, or do I have to get it actually at the workplace?
So I thought someone might ask that. So the way we have it now, you are defined as training while on the job. Any time we observe you to be employed or associated with an employer, and at the same time to be engaged in a training program. So if you think, for example, of in this model, training means taking time away from production and instead spending it on human capital accumulation.
I can work overtime instead of Instead of working overtime, I work 8 hours a day, but then I go to some vocational school at night. That doesn't count. So I'm just asking.
So in this setup, that would, in the way we're estimating the model now, that would count as training. So at the end, I'm going to, in the conclusion slide, I'm going to say maybe we want to adjust this definition. But that would actually be okay within our model insofar as you have a number of hours that are actually worked, and you're paid for those hours, and your hourly wage is calculated off of the actual time spent in production. And then you have some other time that you're spending training. That's certainly another way. But certainly, another way of doing this is to just look at the subset of training episodes that occur on the job or provided by the employer on the employer site.
This is really just on the job, right? We don't really have another decision, you have a job or not. And we don't have decisions about what you're doing outside that formal job.
I see. Okay.
You could be training or engaged in leisure, you could be child production, whatever, right? That's not here.
Which is like measuring the opportunity cost.
Yeah, it's just opportunity cost here at work.
At work. But then the question is whether it's off the job or on the
Yeah,
job.
that's a different question, that's not modeled here.
Empirical question.
Question.
Yes.
So there's a lot of training that's just not labeled training.
Yes.
So what are you doing about that?
We will have to address that. There's going to be, so in the model, we will have something that shows up as training in the model, and then we have something that shows up as training in the data, and we'll show you how we bridge those. But absolutely. We think there's a lot more training actually going on than gets recorded by the analyst-wide training roster. Okay, so there is a big literature on human capital investment. There are models of on-the-job search without investment. There are a bunch of papers written more recently where we have a little bit of both, where it has a search and matching model together with various models of on-the-job training. We do things a little bit differently. So the major difference between what we're doing and what these other papers are doing is that we're going to really take our model to data and try to explore some of these properties of wage growth across and between job spells. And then we're going to explicitly model the cost of training. Our models look a little bit different, have different features than some of the other models. Just one kind of larger question in this literature is the question in which these labor market frictions are either causing firms to provide more or less training. And we don't, in the paper, we don't necessarily have much to say about that, but I will say that we've done some experiments where you reduce the labor market frictions, you take away some of these on-the-job offers from other employers, and what happens is that you get more match-specific training, and the reason for that is that because it extends the expected duration of the current job, that makes the current match value more valuable, so you get more training to increase the current match value. So that's kind of where we are in relation to this, but really we have a little bit of a different agenda. We're much more interested in looking at these wage paths. Okay, so let me tell you what the model looks like. So the model is in continuous time. Workers have a general ability, which we're going to call A, which takes on a set of discrete values. When they enter the labor market, they're going to have an initial value, which is drawn from something that's going to look like a log normal distribution, where the mean of that log normal distribution can depend on their level of education. Once a worker enters the labor market, they're going to meet firms at rate lambda u, and they're going to draw a match value theta. Again, it's going to take on a bunch of discrete values, and the distribution there will approximate, again, a log normal distribution. So once a worker of type A matches and with a match quality theta, the flow productivity of that match is equal to A times theta minus a cost, minus a fixed cost of employment. Now, the reason we need that fixed cost of employment, which when we started out we didn't have that, is that because there's this extra benefit to being employed, that you get to be involved in this training, it's possible that a worker will come to a firm and say, look, I'd like to come work for you. I don't really want to do anything. I just want to take the training. And we need something that's going to prevent that from happening. And so this fixed employment cost is going to take care of that. So the other important piece of the model is the training. So workers can change either their general ability or their match quality by investing.
Sorry. Wouldn't the minimum wage take care of that as well?
Yes. So you could do that with yes.
So the worker would just pay the firm.
Yes. So you can imagine doing something where you impose a minimum wage, and that's going to rule out certain certain of that. But what we didn't really want to do is we didn't want to tie the minimum wage to this question of how much training to provide.
These are all empirical questions, and they were just gonna estimate this, right? But finally, when we estimated that we get more reasonable estimates of policy functions and stuff like that, than if we force it to be zero. And just by, when you have a matching function with vacancy cost, right? And typically there's a flow vacancy cost. You said, why shouldn't there be a flow employment cost as well, right?
All right. So for a worker who spends a fraction tau A of time in general training, her ability is going to increase at this rate. And so there's a general TFP. There's something that's dependent on the state, and then a concave function of the amount of time. Similarly, for a worker who is not already at the highest match value and spends a fraction of time tau theta, the value of the match rate is going to increase at this rate. Again, a TFP, something dependent on the state, and a function of the amount of time spent. The cost of training is the just foregone output. So for a match of worker A at a match of quality theta who spends tau A and tau theta, this is going to be the total amount produced. So it's just the flow value of the time spent on production minus this cost. And in addition to the possibility of increasing these states, they're also going to be able to decrease, and those are going to happen at constant rates. And finally, an employed worker is going to receive new offers on the job at rate lambda E, and those offers will be at the same distribution of match values as we saw for the unemployed worker.
Just to make clear that once you get an improvement, you go up by 1, the distribution. It's continuous time, so that's not a restriction.
Okay, so the unemployed worker is going to receive a flow value BA and receive offers at rate lambda U. We write down the value function as VU of A, and the value function of the employed worker as VE of A and theta. So the value, if you've worked with models like this before, the solution is pretty easy to write down. You write the value is just the flow value for being in unemployment plus the probabilities of receiving these various acceptable job offers, and you weight each of those values by the rate at which they arrive, and then you discount by something which looks like the discount rate plus something that controls the rate of those offers. There's going to be obviously a threshold value for theta below which it doesn't pay to accept the job and above which it does. So an employed worker is defined by states A and theta, and she's going to face the following shocks. One thing that could happen is an increase in her ability. Second thing that could happen is an increase in the match value. Also, ability could decrease. Match value can decrease. There's going to be a rate of exogenous separation, which we're going to call eta, and then she can receive a better outside offer. So the offers come in at rate lambda E, and then she'll accept the outside offer if it's a higher theta value than the current value. Now, some of these shocks may cause her to endogenously dissolve the match and go into unemployment if unemployment is better than the new state. This is what the value function looks like. Again, in the numerator, you have the flow plus all of these terms from things that could happen, and then all get discounted, and the choice to either stay in the match or to become unemployed. All right, so the last part of the model is the bargaining problem. So when a worker and a firm get together, they're going to have to decide on the wage, on the amount of general training, and on the amount of match-specific training. And they're going to do that by solving a Nash bargaining problem. For the firm, the outside option has value 0, so it's a free entry condition. For the worker, the outside option is always unemployment, so it's not the best previous job offer. And the reason we do that is we already have 2 possible sources of wage growth, right? We already have increases in A and increases in theta, and we thought it's already hard enough to separate how much of each of those is happening, and we thought it may be one step too hard to say another source of wage growth is going to be these outside options that the worker gets that they can use as a negotiating point. And Chris has a previous paper showing that empirically this works just as well. So that pretty much finishes up the model. So the next thing we need is some data. So we're going to take data from the NLSY 97 cohort. So the sample we're going to use is the nationally representative sample. So we're not going to use the oversampling of minorities. We're going to restrict our sample to males who have no military service, who have at least a high school degree, and then we're going to start them in the model after their last period of school enrollment. And this gives us about 2,000 people. We're going to consider 3 different states three different amounts of education: high school graduates, those with some college, and those with at least a BA or higher, and the sample is pretty evenly split between those three categories. From the NLSY, we're going to take employment transitions from the weekly employment roster. So the NLSY records each week whether you were associated with an employer. We're going to take wage observations only from the annual interview dates. So the NLSY has wages at each of those weekly observations, but we think if we just take it at the interview, it's likely to be higher quality rather than trusting the respondent to reconstruct his wage history week by week. The last thing we need from the NLSY is the training data. So they have a training roster which identifies when workers are engaged in training. And again, we're going to take anyone as training on the job if we see them employed and simultaneously engaged in one of these training episodes. Because this is a relatively recent cohort, the people in our data only go up to age 32.
Can you remind me, is training, you just do it or you don't, or is there an intensive margin on training?
So in the data, in the model there's these taus which can be continuous. You can spend, but in the data there is some measures of intensity, but we're just going to use 1 zeros from the data about whether in any given week you report that you were engaged, and we're not going to use anything about intensity of training.
Is there any measure of what the training is other than just the hours, the engagement that you do it with? I mean,
Yes.
In other words, is this training that's related to some particular skill? I don't know what the data shows.
So there is a lot of information on the types of training, right? So that was the. So
I'm just saying about
the quality of the training.
Just some idea of whether I'm getting more or less out of this training. I'm not quite sure what this training means.
So we have the kind of training, and we would have the intensity of the training, but I don't think we have any other measures of quality, and we don't at this stage at least we're not using any data.
Right, there's not that many spells for training also, right? There's not that many people reporting these training episodes. So there's a limit what you can sort of do with it. If you want to break it down by subcategories, it'd be really very few people.
Yeah. So one thing we might want to do is just restrict, say, certain kinds of training do count and certain kinds of training don't count. But I don't think we want to go any more in depth than in terms of quality of the. Yeah. Okay. So here's the wage data that we want to take from the data in order to identify the model. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at log wage growth for people who stay on the job. So people who are on the same job from one interview to the next. And we're going to break it out by education level. So we think that's a proxy for the worker's general ability. And then we're also going to break it out by the length of the spell. So if you think that a worker who gets a higher draw of theta is likely to be in that job for a longer period of time, because it's less likely they'll be able to get a superior outside offer, the jobs that last longer should be associated with the higher values of theta. So you can look. So we're here looking at wage growth. And we have some heterogeneity in A and some heterogeneity in theta, and those are some of the moments we're going to use to identify exactly when are people getting training based on the wage growth in different states. So you see, in short spells, so at low values of theta, it seems like people with more education are getting larger amounts of wage growth, and then at higher values of theta, so for longer spells, the bottom two rows. That pattern seems to be reversed, and the people who have a little bit less education seem to be increasing their wage a little more quickly. So we actually don't use these moments in the data, but one kind of feature of the data that we're after is this issue of how does wages change conditional on people who have received training or have not received training. So if you look at people who have received training already in their job and ask, do they get more or less wage growth? If they stay on the same job, we don't see much of a difference. People who do switch jobs, those people who had not gotten training in the previous jobs seem to have larger jumps in wages as they transition from one job to the next. And we see that a lot of that difference comes from job transitions where there's no intervening stage of non-employment. So this is some of the data that we're after. Okay. So we have the model, we have the data, so we're going to estimate the parameters of the model with the method of simulated moments. The moments we're going to take are, we take transition rates from this weekly employment roster, so E to E, E to U, U to E. We're going to look at the distribution of wages by education and by years in the labor force. We're going to look at the distribution of job spell lengths, and then this data I showed you a little while ago, where we look at wages by tenure, by job spell length, and by education. And then the last thing we're going to take is we're going to look at differences in training by different education levels. And then the last thing we have to do is we have to map the amount of training that we see in the data to the amount of training that we see in the model. We think there's a lot more training that workers are actually receiving not just from formally observed training programs, but from mentoring, from people helping them with things, from people showing them how to do things on the job. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the amount of time that people in the model spend training over a 6-month period, and we're going to map that probabilistically into whether or not we would actually see training in the data during that period. So there phi is the normal CDF.
Can I ask a clarification about the data training? So do you have a way to distinguish whether they choose to do the training or whether it's mandatory by the employer? Is there any way in the NLSY one can distinguish between when actually they positively want to do it and they seek it?
No.
There's no way.
But you're selecting a package, really a firm.
But in our model, it's all cooperative anyway, so they both agreed on the training, you know?
No, but I'm saying when you're searching, trying to find a new firm. Some of the
No, in
job
this
offers-
case, yeah, in this case, it's not like that. It's not like Elbow Rosen paper or something where you have different investment content of different jobs. Here, there's the same possible choices at every possible job you could have.
I mean, if it's the wage offer distribution, I mean, is that indexed?
No, the wage, no, but it's, the
other
wage
words,
you
I get a- I
get,
get
the
a
wage you
job
get
and
will be a
training.
function of your current A and theta and how much training you're taking.
Right.
But that function will be the same at all firms. There's no firm heterogeneity here, for example, of any type.
So both your wage and how much time you spend on each kind of training will be dependent on both worker
So the
and employee.
variation across firms that you see in workers and training is just a consequence of your worker choice.
Firms all the same, basically. Firms are all the same.
And you
yeah.
think that firms might be heterogeneous in this way, right? That people would sort of.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That'd be one way to think about how you price out.
Well, I mean, the more macro guys, they'll put, they'll have firm heterogeneity there to begin with. Typically, we won't, because we're not using meshed data for one thing, boilerplate data, so we downplay firm heterogeneity.
All right. So these are the parameters we get. So we have a positive flow value of unemployment. So a lot of times you do these models, you get a negative B. So in this model there's an extra incentive to take a job because of the training opportunities. So to the extent you think that's well identified, that's what pushes that up. Unemployed workers get a job. These are all weekly. So about every 7 weeks on average, and they take about 1/3 of the job offers. So they're transitioning from unemployment into employment about every 21 weeks. The rate of job offers for people who are employed is about half as great. And then finally, there's exogenous job separation rate, which averages out to once every 6 years. And then given our parameters, about 3/4 of the job separations are exogenous, and about 1/4 of the job separations are endogenous, meaning they're reflecting a shock which causes someone to then choose unemployment in the new state. So looking at the parameters of the investment functions, so starting here, so the state dependence of the general ability investment is very slightly negative. So at higher values of A, we see the productivity of that general training is very slightly lower. And then for theta, it's positive. So at higher values of theta, that the value of that training the productivity of that training goes up. And then we have a pretty sizable employment cost. So you can think of this as a wage. Okay.
So that just means that there's sort of increasing returns in theta, right? So the better batches are getting more investment, basically, and the other one's flat. The general goal.
All right. So let's see. All right, we have time. Okay. So in terms of how the model fits, this is the amount of training we get. So the orders of magnitude looks right, and then we get this decreasing pattern that people at higher higher amounts of education seem to get less training, and we get that relationship about right. And also the timing we get about right. So if you look at the people who get at the beginning of the job spell versus later in the job spell, maybe we're a little bit high. Maybe we're a little bit high for some people, but overall we're getting a good fit of both how much training there is overall and when it occurs in the job spell. So if you look now that other set of moments I showed you, which was log wage growth for job stayers, we do pretty well for these longer job spells in terms of matching both the levels and the patterns, not so well among the shorter ones. So in the data, it looks like maybe those with more education are increasing wages a little bit faster, and we don't quite get that in the model.
Question? Going
Yes.
back one slide. So are those statements about what you see in the data or the estimate of the distribution of tau?
Are those statements? So the data is taken from the data, and then the model is, and then the model represents a combination of how much tau there is plus this stochastic measurement. No, that's something comparable to the model training. So that's after you take tau, you run it through this measurement function, and that's phi of, yes, it's phi of beta plus beta 1 tau. Sorry?
What can you say about tau?
We'll say a lot about tau. Give me that in another minute. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's look at the trade-offs that firms and workers face in just determining how much training to provide and how much wages to offer. So when a worker and a firm come together, they have to decide both the wage and general training and match-specific training. So I'm gonna plot in this graph kind of the combinations that solve the bargaining problem. So on the horizontal axis, the amount of general training; on the vertical axis, the amount of match-specific training; and then lines showing what the wages are at each combination. So this blue dot over here is what they actually choose. So if you look at this area of the graph, you see the lines are very vertical. So what that means is that if you were to increase the amount of match-specific training, you would have to pay the worker essentially the same wage. So the firm is bearing most of the cost of the match-specific training. Conversely, if you go sideways and vary the amount of general training, that you see as you increase the amount of general training, the wage falls pretty quickly. So the worker is bearing most of the cost of the general training, which is what you'd expect. But not all, right? They're not totally vertical, so there's some sharing. Okay, so in terms of the benefits to general training versus match-specific training, so general training is going to increase productivity both at current and future jobs. It also increases the worker's flow value of unemployment, so the worker is going to receive most of the benefit, and they're going to pay most of the cost. Match-specific training also increases the productivity at the current job. One thing that turns out to be important about match-specific training is that it increases with the expected duration of the current job. So the longer you expect to be at the current job, the more it pays to invest in match-specific training. Another benefit to the employer to providing match-specific training is as you increase theta, you make it less likely that the worker will be able to get a dominant outside offer. So that's going to increase the length of the current job spell, which is a benefit to the employer. And so the employer is going to bear most of the cost of this training. So looking then at the policy functions, so here we're going to plot as a function of workers' ability what that minimum that reservation value is, so how high theta has to be before they'll take the job. So what happens at low values of A is it's decreasing. So for workers of very low ability, in order to make this match have enough output to overcome this cost, they would need to wait for a slightly higher value of theta. Then as A increases, you can get away with accepting a lower value of theta, so this falls. Then for a while it's flat, and at the very top of the ability distribution, it's going to go back up. So what's happening is that down here, these marginal matches involve a lot of general training. So the only reason that the worker is going to take these marginal matches is because of the general training that it provides. And at the very top of the ability distribution, that general training is no longer so valuable, so the worker then demands a higher value of theta before he's willing to take the job. So now we can look at taus. So this is the policy functions for the time spent on match-specific training. So again, we're going to plot worker ability on the x-axis, the value of the match on the y-axis. And And then this bottom region here, this is the region where there's no matches. These are the regions where theta is too low and the match doesn't form. And then above, I'm going to, again, a contour plot showing how much time, what fraction of time they're spending on match-specific training. So the first thing to notice is that from the bottom up to about here, the amount of match-specific training increases with the value of theta. And there are a couple things driving this. One is that because of the estimated value, the estimated parameters in the production function, at higher values of theta, it's more productive to engage in theta training. The other thing that happens is that as theta goes up, the expected duration of the current match increases, and that again makes it more efficient to engage in match-specific training. At higher values, it goes down. At some point, it doesn't pay to invest in theta anymore if theta is already high enough. The other thing to notice is that there's not a lot of A dependence in this graph. There's a little bit if you look kind of in the middle, right? So over here, workers with higher ability are going to get a little bit more training than workers with less training. So if you're matched with a worker of higher ability, there's a little bit more of incentive to increase the theta to go along with that at higher A, because A and theta are complements, and also a little bit more of an incentive to try to keep that worker longer. All right, so the next piece is the time spent on general training. Again, the same idea, worker ability on the x-axis, match value on the y-axis. This bottom region is something where the match doesn't form. And these contours, again, show what the amount of the fraction of time spent on general training for each state value. So you see at the bottom, so these are low theta matches. Theta is just above the reservation value. There's a lot of training, as I mentioned before. And then as you go up, either in A or in theta, you get less time spent on general training. So some of this variation in A is explained by the production function. So as A increases, it becomes less productive to invest in A. And then some of this reflects the fact that time spent on general training is essentially part of the worker's compensation. It's essentially benefits that flow largely to the worker. So if you look at the next picture where we look at the amount of wage that workers are receiving as a fraction of the output, you see it has kind of the same pattern. So at higher values of ability or higher values of theta, the worker is capturing less of the total output. So this is reflecting the bargaining position of the worker. So the worker it has a little bit less bargaining power as you go up to that upper right corner, and we think that explains both the wages that she's getting as well as the amount of general training that she's being given.
The bargaining power is the same everywhere.
The bargaining weights are the same, but where you are relative to your outside option.
You get less of a shift.
Okay, so those are the policy functions. Now we can look at the simulations and ask how much training do people actually get. So this is tau. This is the amount of tau that people actually get in the model. So it looks like people are spending, in this model, something like 25% of their time investing in human capital. So the blue line is the total, the red is the amount of general training, green is match-specific training. So over time, theta increases, both because you're building up theta by investing it on the job, and also as you transition from job to job. So the average value of theta increases as you go through your career. And so what that means is that you'll recall that general training is decreasing in theta, so general training drops off a little bit. Match-specific training is increasing at first and then decreasing. So it rises and peaks about 2 years into the labor force and then declines slightly. So the other thing we can look at is wage growth and what's driving wage growth in this model. So abstracting for a second from these extra employment costs, if you had the zeta equal to 0, so the output was just A times theta times the amount of time you spent not training, then you could write the wage as just A times theta times the time spent not training times the fraction of that total output that flowed to the worker as wages. And you could break that down into logs, and you could decompose the log into the log of A, the log of theta, the log of time spent not training, and the fraction of the wage that goes to the fraction of the output that goes to the worker in the form of a wage. And we can plot each of those components, again, as a fraction of the years in the labor force to see what's driving wage growth in this model. So the blue line is the total log wage, and that's matched to the data. And you see that most of the wage growth is coming from the green line, from increases from specific theta in the value of the match. And that's happening, again, both because it's increasing within a job spell, and also it's increasing as workers move from one job spell to the next. And that's driving a lot of the wage growth, especially in the early years, as workers kind of sort into better matches, and also have this initial buildup of theta within jobs. The red line shows the increase in general human capital, and you see that's kind of increasing more slowly, but it continues to increase. And as you get a couple years into the labor force, the increase in general human capital and match-specific human capital are contributing equal amounts. In addition, there's a boost because over time you're spending less time training, so you're actually producing more, and that's that orange line. And that last piece where you look at what fraction of the output is flowing to the workers' wage, that doesn't actually move very much.
I'm not sure I understand. I would have thought these early years where there's a lot of turnover across firms for
Yes.
workers. How is it that the match-specific human capital plays such an important? What's the economic?
So a lot of it is that turnover. As workers start out with low values of theta, they're much more like.
Well, they're just matching to better theta.
Yeah.
It's not that they're not because of their investment necessarily, but because of the.
It's both, but a lot of it is the turnover.
Okay.
So can you decompose that green line into how much is training accumulation within job as
Yes.
opposed to between jobs?
Yes, we should do that.
Because
Yeah.
the point would be that early on there would be a lot of destruction
Yep.
of that specific capital as well.
Yep. Yeah, we have.
No, because you wouldn't
No, no.
be doing it.
Well, maybe. So it depends on what kind of wage determination model you have in mind, actually.
Right.
And what's funny here is, it's because there's increasing returns, you don't invest that much for marginal values of theta. It's only when you get a good one, you start
Right.
going crazy, and that's what locks you into the job.
You could look at, for example, the amount of investment that gets lost because the wage gets dissolved. That might be interesting from an efficiency point of view. We should do that. Okay, so we have two kinds of training. We have this match-specific training and general training, and you might ask whether we really need both of these or whether we would have been better off just having one. So let me tell you why, just from an identification point of view, we see evidence for both of these. So we re-estimate the model with only general training, meaning that for each worker, A is fixed throughout the life cycle. And that means that all the wage growth is going to come from changes in theta. So that means that all the wage growth within a job spell is going to come from increases in theta. And that means over time, theta is going to increase more and more. And the theta values will in general be higher. And that means that the wage growth, when you then go from that job to a new job, is going to be smaller. So we find that in a model where we only have general training, we can't match both the wage growth within spells as well as this wage growth across job transitions. Conversely, if we have a model with only match-specific training, meaning that theta is fixed within each match, then all of the wage growth within a job spell is going to come from changes in A. And that means, by the way we set up the production functions, where the productivity of A training only depends on A, and the productivity of theta training only depends on theta, that the current match value doesn't have any role in changing the productivity of training. And then we have trouble matching the amount of wage growth that we see at shorter duration jobs, which we think of as low theta, versus higher duration jobs, which we think of as high theta. We don't have that extra margin to match those separately. So that's kind of it.
That's our identification.
That's our identification. Yeah.
That's conditional on certain functional forms, though, right?
Yeah. Oh.
We're
Yes.
not claiming non-parametric at that.
All right.
Okay, so I have 5 minutes left. So we're going to do a policy experiment. So we're going to impose a minimum wage. So we're going to impose a minimum wage of $10.17. So the dollars in this model are $1997. So that's $15 for 2014. And here's what happens. So the first thing that happens is, yes.
We're running out of time. I can give you more time. But I mean, I know lots. No, seriously. But just in terms of the standard wage reduction, there's a lot of stuff where you look at tenure correctly.
Yes.
So tenure affects versus kind of long-term experience. I'm just wondering how this would break down that standard wage regression. So in some sense, you're asking what would be the effect of staying on the given firm, right? Because I haven't quite seen how you nested this into the.
This makes clear that it's all endogenous, right?
No, it's endogenous, right? But I'm just wondering what you would get is kind of like a 10-year effect.
If you
And
wanted
then
to,
correcting or not
you could use
correcting
these
for
data and run a
endogenous.
Mincer regression. You wanna
Right,
do
that's
that.
what I'm saying.
You could certainly do that.
Right, so I'm just saying, just
Yeah.
how much
Yeah.
would this help us eliminate those
Yeah.
kinds of standard regression? And change some of these other discussions like Topel and
Yeah.
Ward, for example, and some of the more recent work where we're trying to do that. I'm just curious how this would help us understand. They're going over a larger part of
And
the
they
life
don't
cycle.
really have a formal model turnover either.
No, they don't, and they don't belong to these forces of endogeneity. There's some work by Ada and Dustin, right, where they're allowing for some, but it's a very different model.
Yeah.
But it's a model where they're actually looking at the structure of people choosing apprentices, I think, versus not, and getting some notion about these.
Yeah, ours is a more continuous version.
No, I understand, I just wondered how you relate them. It'd be interesting to do
Yeah.
that position.
Should do that, thank you. All right, so we're going to propose the minimum wage. So, so the first thing that happens is now for very low values of A, some of these matches which were feasible before are no longer feasible because the wage wouldn't be high enough. So the reservation value goes up for low values of A, which is not surprising. Increases the unemployment rate by about 1%. The more interesting result from this model is the effect on training. So we're going to plot that same graph I showed you before, showing training by years in the labor force. So the solid lines are what I had before, and then the dashed lines show the counterfactual with the higher minimum wage. And so what happens is that there's less training. And the reason there's less training is entirely because there's less general training, right? So a worker comes in and they have what they would have agreed on. Now the government says, no, you have to pay a higher wage. And the employer turns around to the worker and says, fine, I will pay you that higher wage, but I'm not going to give you all the general training. So what happens is that they get, I'll show you the wage in a second. So the wages actually are higher. So for people just starting on the job market, they're about 6% higher, and that decreases over time to about 1.5%, right? Because over time, you're getting less accumulation of A than you otherwise would. And that extra wage breaks down pretty evenly into three different pieces. So one is the selection to higher match quality. So because workers are selecting to higher match quality, that increases the productivity. The second thing that happens is because they're engaging in less training, they actually are producing more output, and some of that extra output flows to the worker in the form of a higher wage. And then finally, just the worker is going to capture a higher fraction of that total output because of the states where they have to pay the worker that higher wage in order to meet the minimum. Yeah.
So if this is general training, wouldn't it be relatively easy for the firm and the workers to undo this policy, and the firm would just tell the worker, hey, you go out in the evening and take this class on your own and solve the problem? So there's a question of labeling what's working at that point, right?
Yeah. Right. So I don't know. No, that's true.
Your assumption of bargaining.
Well, you
amount-
might have cautiously unbundled that though, right?
That's
That's
yeah.
just might be some.
And that gets back to the original question about formal schooling and schooling outside of the job. And you might think the general ability here is something, sounds general, sounds indistinguishable, but general ability you can acquire in a junior college or something, for example, outside the job. But they can, they could certainly. One of the things about this is you could hire someone in principle with lower flow utility, lower flow productivity than the minimum wage, and even exacerbate that by giving them training with the hope of getting them over the hump, right? It would depend on what if the contact rates are really low. You might say, it's going to take me forever to find another guy. I'll take this guy. That was one of the motivations for the whole project, was in the world of mismatch and so on, how much can you undo mismatch here, or policies like minimum wage by training on the job in some way.
So overall, there's a very small welfare loss for less educated workers coming both from the higher unemployment rate and from the lower amounts of general training. All right, so that's about what we have. So we've shown a model where we've argued that there are patterns in wage growth that suggest both increases in match-specific human capital as well as general human capital. It turns out in our simulations that the improvements in match quality or equivalently match-specific human capital forms a lot of the overall growth in wages. And this is because the firm has very strong incentives to provide this training. But of course, this training dissolves when the match dissolves. And then finally, we've done this counterfactual where we show the minimum wage not only increases unemployment, but also reduces the amount of general training that workers receive. Going forward, one thing we are going to do next is put this in a general equilibrium framework. Another thing that we
So in terms of like rate of arrival, just in terms of your model.
yes,
So if the
exactly.
firm is actually finding itself with very, very low rates of arrival, presumably that's going to drastically affect the way that changes. Have you done those kinds of
Well, that's what we're doing. In general equilibrium, we'll get a matching function, and we'll get the matching function, we'll be able to say,
I'm just thinking, even in this framework, this variance.
just varying it. See
Yeah,
what
I'm just seeing what happens.
Just like compare
Because in the end,
stats.
it
or
comes down to the fact there might be no
changes.
effect. right?
Yeah.
Might be
Yeah.
no effect.
Yeah.
That would be what people are arguing about.
Yeah.
In your literature.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's supported.
As mentioned before, the question of what we define as on-the-job training. So right now we just have when you formally enroll in training while employed, and we may think we might restrict that. And then finally, one thing we probably won't do in this paper, but maybe going forward, is to include the choice of not just accumulation of human capital on the job, but to combine that with the education decisions that happened earlier.
You can model that. It's flexible in the model. You can actually think about unbundling these education choices. I mean, I don't know how much complexity.
Well, I've got a paper with Mullins that does that, does the before market, but then doesn't allow this, and we got that, so you could probably put it.
Put it together.
Thank you, Figura Madonna, per discuss.
All right, so I'm going to do a discussion of the search, matching, and training. I'm going to repeat some of the things that have been said during the presentation, but I'm also going to focus on very narrow set of comments. I have plenty, but I'll give them to you later. Okay, so what the paper is about. What is the paper about? So it builds and estimates a model of the labor market with what I think are the main ingredients is this human capital framework that has both match-specific and general. Okay, that's very nice. And it has this ability to invest in both with training while you're on the job. And as we said, it's a joint decision. So it's not really that the firm makes a decision, it's a bargaining. And also there's mobility frictions, which is important in this context. Well, it's very important for several economic questions, right? But there's potential under investment in human capital. I'm sure that's all coming in the future or like in the final draft of the paper. A long-term effect of policies that shift investments, that's one of the things you look at in the minimum wage. Of course, there's like a very important measurement challenge. I mean, this is huge, right? I mean, here we're trying to say, we're not going to observe this human capital. We're not even going to observe overall human capital. We're not even going to observe whether it's general or specific, but we want to recover that from the model, right? And so it's definitely an observed with the econometrician. And I'm going to try to talk about this. Because the counterfactual of interest that we want to talk about are going to be ones where the equilibrium amount of training provided by firm is going to be shifted. So we want to get those things correctly. So actually, to get this right, what we require here is, first we need to separately identify the effect of both general and match-specific training. Second, we need to understand how they vary within the match over time and when they're at higher or low level. And third, we also need to recover the investment function, the curvature of that function, because that's what's going to matter in the response in the counterfactual. And that's a lot, right? What they're going to do in this paper, they're going to use NLSY 97, but they're going to have data on training. So at least if you think of recovering something like the curvature of overall return to training, you could do that because you actually observe this. And I thought that was very nice to actually have data on training at least. The second bit is to differentiate general from specific, and it was mentioned before. What's going to happen, they're going to make some modeling assumptions, and that's going to generate implication for wages and mobility that's going to allow to disentangle those two. And I thought that was very nice. I thought that was actually one of kind of the main part of the paper, or the main point of the paper, the main contribution. The small standard error suggests that the parameters are tightly pinned down by the data under the specification that we have. However, I think it's still very important to understand what sort of assumptions drive the parameters that we find, and particularly in one of those 1, 2, and 3 layers. Let's call them layers. So I think this is a central point of the paper, and that the two types of human capital have different applications for job mobility and wage growth. Right? To provide intuition about what that means in this particular model, what they do is they do two types of estimation on top of the estimation of the general model. They estimate a model where you cannot make investment in A, which is general human capital, and they make another type of estimation where you cannot make investment in theta. They don't shut down A and theta, the heterogeneity, they just shut down the investments that you can make while on the job. Okay? And what they say is, well, when you shut down investment in A, you cannot match both wage growth and of stayers and movers. Okay, and I'll talk about this in a second. And then when you shut down the theta investments, you cannot match differences in wage growth and separation between short and long panels. That was not in the draft, the tables, but I think that it's fine. So what in the model is going to create those links? And I'm going to say that some are going to be driven by bargaining assumptions, some by random search assumptions with free entry, energy separation, forget about this, and some others, for me, was not so clear, and it might be coming from formal functional form assumptions. And I think it's important. So here the state space is only A and theta. Okay? What does the bargaining without commitment give you in this environment? And it was brought up in the presentation. It makes the equilibrium wages a direct function of A and theta. Now you don't have to carry the last outside option, et cetera, which makes it much more complicated. It creates a very tight link between any movement in the wages and any movements of those two underlying human capital. Of course, you cannot disentangle if it's more A, less theta, or more theta, less A. Okay? In comparison, if you were to go sequential contracting, well, the wage growth would also be triggered by other offers. It adds complication. So I think it makes sense here to look at this setting. Even though I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion, but when we do use employer match data, we find strong effect of past firms on wages after the move. So I think there is evidence in the data that there are those effects. Second of all, I think there's also there is a random search plus free entry assumption. What does that give you? Well, what that gives you is that the free entry implies that jobs are ranked by values of theta. You don't have, you have a sorting model where different workers prefer different firms differently. Here, the ranking is the same for everyone. So that's very convenient. Because it means that the mobility, random search, the free entry, the random search is going to imply that all A and theta sample from the same distribution as theta. And what that's going to give you is that any investment in theta will lower the J2J transition and the gain of J2 transition, and it's going to be independent of the investment of A. So this is this is a very strong restriction that the model imposes, that it's going to be very informative in the data. And I'll talk a bit about more. So now let's go back to the statement that we had about so we had that no investment in A can match both growth for stayers and movers. All right? As we said, so this all wage growth has to be driven by theta. That's what we're saying. And this is going to lower the J2J probability and wages growth on J2J independently of the value A. So I think this is a very clean argument. It's very convincing under the model assumptions because the free entry makes it that the ranking is the same. It's only what you sample. A random search will give you this. The second one, I was not completely sure about. So the second one is that if you don't have theta investment, you cannot match the differences in wage growth and separation between short and long spells. So the idea is that in the data, the EU rate decreases with tenure. So the probability of losing your job decreases with tenure. And what I was thinking is I feel like I could come up with a rigged process for A that would still generate this, in the sense that I could just have that I have a high probability of losing my job and of getting a low shock, and it would be dependent at different. I mean, it's rigged, but it just said that somewhere in there, the functional form assumption is going to give you that.
That homogeneity assumption is important.
Yeah. So this is what I thought. It said, how important is it to have the fixed depreciation rate here? And second of all, what if you don't allow them to invest in theta, but you leave the depreciation? What would that give you? Because it would give you actually a lot of braking at the beginning, still wage growth, and I think it might even generate it without having the investment, but just the depreciation. And I want just to show the parameter estimates. So I did a bit of copy and paste, so it's a bit blurry. But the values are here. So we see actually that the rate of decrease in theta is very high, which I think is what generates those separations early. And I think if you were to leave this and shut down the investment, you might still get... So the second argument, I think, is a bit looser than the first one. And then this is the thing by job tenure, but the same story. Okay, so given the clean insight, I thought, of how investment in theta affects mobility independently of A, why can't we look also at moments such as transition rates interacted with training? And so this, I don't know if it's possible. because it means that you need to see someone in a job, he was in another job, and maybe he got training, and you want to interact those things and the probability of moving. But I thought, given that this is so clean, given the model assumption, I think you could get a lot of traction out of this. Okay? The second point I wanted to make here is that the estimation relies on matching moments, a lot of moments, unconditional of training. So a lot of what happens in matching the data here is about matching those unconditional moments. And actually, the moment conditional on training are not always themselves well matched. And there's one, so you showed the first one. These ones, I would consider that very well matched. So which are the percentage of training that different education level get. But the other one that I thought was a bit surprising is the fit of the log wage differences between interviews by training, particularly for job switchers. Particularly for job switchers that go through unemployment. I think here, so maybe the numbers have changed as well. So this one, so if you look at job switchers with non-employment spell, in the model you get very, very negative values. But so here what happens, you have, let's say, either an exogenous separation shock or an endogenous one, but in the case of the exogenous, you should keep your A. And so in a sense, like the value you get when you come out is very informative about this. So what I'm going to say about this, it's going to be very loose as well. Of course, that may be because of large weights on unconditional moments, because those are very well measured in the data. So we know when we do minimum distance, well, that's what you're going to get. So this together with a tight specification. So I think to get an idea of what's going on, I think, well, this is a common problem. Okay, I think we all face this when we do moment-based estimation. So one thing, okay, the hard thing is to make it more flexible in the unconditional moment dimension. I think that's too hard. I think that's too much work, probably. The second one is try to estimate with larger weights on moments that are interacted with training and see whether that changes a lot the counterfactuals, okay? 20 seconds or 1 minute, okay. This I already showed. I think a similar, so now remember when I did the first slide, here I only talk about trying to get an idea of how much general and how much specific there is. But there's something else in here, is that we also need to get the curvature of those things. And I would like to also understand better like how sensitive it is to this. So I think one thing, so the joint curvature of investments is pinned down by the incidence of training in the data. So we see that the different incidence of trading by higher and lower education, and you match that well. And I think that could get a bit of that curvature. But also, I think in the spirit of the no A, no theta training estimation that you do, maybe you could do one where you pin down the relative curvature of one versus the other. So you let them invest, you leave the constant, but you pin down the curvature and you see how sensitive the counterfactuals are to this. Okay? And I also thought another thing is, why not look at the return of training at different wage levels? So interact education with training and stuff. And you might have done this. And maybe okay. So that's it. The conclusion, 39 seconds. Super ambitious papers, because I think not only does it tackle human capital investment, it does both like general and specific human capital together with mobility friction. It uses data on training to discipline this investment and this investment function overall. And then it uses a carefully designed model and its implication to separate the two types of human capital. And I think it's nice, this idea that the investment of theta independently of A is going to affect the mobility and job transition of wage growth. I mean, I think empirically that should be very, should have a lot of bite. And so a few potential solutions for the final draft. Emphasize moment interacted with training for estimation. Sensitive analysis to those different investment function curvature, I think. And then an efficiency measure. I mean, I thought like the paper, but I'm sure that's coming. Just when you put the equilibrium, have an idea of like whether those decisions are efficient or not, and probably they're not. And that's it. Okay?
Thank you. So a lot of good suggestions, and you definitely picked up a lot of the issues we have, right? So identification here is very tough and relies very heavily on functional forms. We do have, so we have calculated, we have a lot of moments that are interacted by training, and in different iterations we either weight them or unweight them or weight them higher. So we haven't. In this version, we only use the ones we report. We definitely considered and tried to use those. In terms of these matching these. So the model that's currently set up has really strong predictions for what these transitions, what the wages should look like on these job transitions where you go through unemployment. Right? So if you had a lot of taking a lot of new job offers from on the job search, and theta is kind of built up, and in addition you have more theta, your theta investment, so theta is again built up. When you go back to unemployment and take a new job, the model predicts pretty unambiguously that you should end up with a lower a lower
And
wage.
maybe indicate that they should be maybe higher A investment somewhere.
Yes, so I think that would be better. I don't.
Conflict with that, allowing them to have A when they're unemployed, for example.
Yes, I thought that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, we tried that. Then of course that messes with the question of, well, now you can either gain A by taking a job or by training on the unemployed, and unemployed starts to become a little bit like school and being on the job.
Yeah. No, so I mean it's just because it's a paper about training inside the firm, right? And
Yeah.
so I think you want to focus on this moment and the fact that there's a training. I think that's what
When we went into this, the first thought was, oh, here's this moment that's really going to pin down exactly what's going on, and we just the model is structured. It really just has a lot of trouble with that, and it's actually and common across this class of models to not be able to hit those moments.
Yeah, I think that in terms of matching the wage changes when there's a unemployment spell in between, it's true that the fact that we're getting that negative change and then the data is positive, that means we're overstating the contribution of data to overall wages. And then you said, why don't you then try, or why wouldn't the estimation put more weight on A then, in terms of how much it contributes to wages? I mean, that is one thing to think about, but then A has such strong implications on the overall wage growth over the life cycle and then throughout the whole labor market career, about how the wage changes within the jobs, and then other things get messed up. And
this is sort of sensitivity analysis, because those should be the very important ones.
sorry?
So I just thought this is a nice sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, no, that is that is a very valid point. And then one other thing is, I think you mentioned, why don't we condition on previous training, on the training status on the previous job? That is what we do, right? Whenever we have training.
Yeah, we definitely calculate those moments, and we've used it in various iterations.
Yeah. And then one thing is that putting more weight on those moments, as Steve, I think, kind of partially mentioned, is problematic. Those training wages have large variances because you don't observe a lot of training in the data, and problems.
So how much would that affect like the serial correlation problems? I mean, the match is stuff, it's not, the match specific stuff is gonna vanish, it's gonna be like your idiosyncratic shocks.
You mean over time?
Over time, yeah, over time or over
separated?
spells, yeah, over different job spells, like what are the autoregressive properties?
These guys in the end are gonna stick with a job finally. unless
No, I
they-
understand, but
unless
over
they
that
get
course,
data.
you're gonna get some idea what the serial correlation property.
Oh, yeah, no, if we can generate
Yeah.
the data and do any kind of
Right.
pretty mincer regressions and looking over.
Right, no, I just think it would be really interesting. But what about the aggregate stocks? I mean, you have a capacity to sort of break out specific.
Well, you have to use it when you're doing that general equilibrium, you have to compute the value of a vacancy, so
Right.
you've got to take that simulated distribution we get, there's no closed form obviously,
Right.
of the steady state joint distribution
Right.
of A and theta if you hit an unemployed guy, or A if the guy's
Correct.
unemployed.
I'm just wondering, just in terms of like at different stages in the life cycle,
Yeah.
how important is match specific versus general? I mean, you could actually compute that, right? And in terms of measures,
That's, yeah.
and the traditional measures like years of education or something, right? Or recently, some people have looked experience plus education.
We've got a lot of education, but only for initial conditions here. So it's just the three things that map into the likelihood you start off at a given A range, right?
This is log graph that you had at the end, those maybe shared.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So I'm
So you
just,
get
what
to the-
fraction of all human
We've got about 10 more slides if you want to see them.